Today we are having Professor Laxmi Bandlamudi, Department of Psychology, New York, discuss the topic Gender Interpretation of Text and Culture, a comparison between East and West. I welcome ma'am, I welcome in this workshop on behalf of Department of Philosophy, Vasanta College and Department of Philosophy, Delhi University. I would like to request Dr. Manisha, please introduce Bala Lakshmi ma'am. Professor Lakshmi.
Thank you, Archana madam. Ano Bhadra Ritava Yantu Vishwata. Let noble thoughts come to us from all the sides. I, Dr. Manisha Mishra, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Vasanta College for Women. On behalf of the organizing committee, I welcome all of you in the first technical session of the 7 days national workshop on an introduction to women's position in philosophy, jointly organized by Department of Philosophy, Vasanta College for Women, Rajghat, Varanasi, and Gender Champion Committee, Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our eminent speaker of today's session, Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi. She is professor in the Department of Psychology, City University of New York, New York. She has completed her PhD from City University of New York in the year 1994. Her areas of research and professional expertise are dialogic consciousness, cultural psychology, human development, Bakhtin studies, socio-historical epistemology, the Mahabharata, the life of the epic text in the cultural and literary history, and its significance in human consciousness. She grew up in Chennai. She has had a lifelong fascination with epic tales. The experimental knowledge eventually developed into a very prominent literary work, into a scholarly inquiry that becomes a book entitled Dialogics of Self, the Mahabharata and Culture, the History of Understanding and Understanding of History, published from Anthem Press in the year 2010. And as we all know that she has connected with us from New York, so definitely she waked up for us early in the morning as per their standard time. So it's our privilege to have such a distinguished scholar with us. Now, I request Professor Lakshmi to enlighten us with her talk entitled Gendered Interpretation of Text and Culture, a comparison between East and West. On behalf of the committee, I welcome you, madam.
Thank you so much, Archana Tripathi and Manisha, Mishra, and everyone else. I know I'm addressing some very eminent scholars here. So as you rightly pointed out, I'm a psychologist technically, but my work is very interdisciplinary. So one of the dangers of being interdisciplinary and moving between East and West is that you dabble into many things, but you're not an expert on anything, kind of a thing. So there's a certain paradox. But let me set the stage for how I want to sort of handle this or present this work. So certainly gender is a very prominent and one of the most fundamental categories of interpretation. As soon as the child is born, the first question that we ask is it a male or a female? So that we cannot see the world without those gendered categories. Now, when I want to compare this between the East and the West, there are some fundamental issues that makes the gendered interpretations even more complicated. So, by and large, the Western world, I mean, unless you take Nietzsche and Vico and many others, by and large, it is trapped in this kind of a binaries, past and present, male and female, and modern and tradition, and so on and so forth. But I think in the Indian context, at least historically, that doesn't mean that there is no patriarchy and misogyny and all that. But it gets to be even more complicated because the fundamentals of interpretation, that those sorts of binary categories are simply not there. So that means, Advaita, so non-dualism. That non-dualism sort of creates a very multi-layered, and it is incredibly multi-dimensional. So gender is much more complex, sophisticated, and so on in the Indian scene. So, however, we need to understand the categories of interpretation. So, by and large, I approach the problem of Mahabharata not as a textual analysis, as in the literary sense, but I approached it as a problem of interpretation, an epistemological problem. What kind of consciousness the text itself is inviting, right? And how this text has had a whole life. So Manisha earlier, when she gave the title of my work, which is Dialogics of Self, the Mahabharata and Culture, I'm trying to making the argument that Mahabharata itself is inviting a dialogic consciousness. The text is dialogic, the consciousness that it demands is dialogic, and its history has been. So when you look at the text of Mahabharata itself, it has these multiple temporalities. It is something that in the in the forest of Naimisha, a sage is telling to other sages about what he heard in what was told in the Sarpa Yajna. So, there is a kind of so many layers to this text. So that's the reason that the subtitle that I gave was The History of Understanding and Understanding of History. In other words, then we don't simply inherit the text, but we also yes, Avi, is everything all right? My screen is going a little, okay, changes. No, that's fine. As long as you can hear me, just let me know if you are unable to. So the categories of interpretation already have because of the historical changes, the text could be very dialogic, but monologic impulses are already part and parcel of the history. So that's the reason that we need to understand the epistemological and the ethical issues. Those are some of the things that I will try to broadly, in 1 hour's time, we can't do everything. So I'll try to broadly lay out the issues in the gendered interpretations and gender as a category itself. So first and foremost, I want to begin with what a Tamil poet, also a nationalist, Subramanya Bharati, rewrote what was called, the plot in Mahabharata, and that was Panchali Shamadam. In that, he saw the humiliation that Draupadi experiences as a humiliation of Mother India itself. So he saw the Panchali and Mother India as Adi Shakti, Parashakti, and so on. And therefore, he was, the way he framed the problem was that Panchali's custodians, meaning her 5 husbands or the people around, and it has parallels with the nationalist movement too, that they are simply witnessing the incredible humiliation of Draupadi, and these custodians are simply, he uses, they are impotent. They cannot sort of rise to the level of saving the honor of the woman. And therefore, he says, try to generate the strength within, because you are Adi Shakti, Parashakti, and therefore that energy must be unleashed. In order to sort of wake up so the custodians are not going to be capable at all. So he elevates the status. It's already there, but he sort of brings this up. So Draupadi is, when you look at the whole gendered issue, first and foremost, the question that Draupadi raised right in the Mahabharata, whether a woman is a property. So long before feminism and everything came in any other part of the world, you see Draupadi raising this fundamental question. Is she a property? Is the wife a property of the husband? And she is not sort of really appealing to the emotions, but she is taking a very legal approach. So she is addressing the kingdom itself and asks for the validity of this transaction and challenges. So perhaps in the history of human race itself, we could say she was the first woman to challenge the long-held axiom of social life that the wife is a possession of her husband. So she challenged that to the kingdom itself, and rightfully so, not to the husband, but later on she comes to the husband or husbands. So Draupadi is a kind of an irritant to the patriarchy itself. She's both temptation and terror because she is very much sought after by so many, right? In addition to her 5 husbands, she's also, there is quite a bit of an assault that goes on, and whether it is Kichak or whether it is Jayadratha or numerous characters, or Dushashan and Duryodhan and so on. So on one hand, nobody questioned when Draupadi was made into a pawn. Nobody answered her questions. So to this day, I think the questions that she raised in Hastinapur court still remains unanswered. I mean, we have gone back and forth. I would like to make the argument, Amrita Preetham, the Punjabi writer, she wrote a piece, which I did not read it. I only know about the title, Draupadi Se, Draupadi Tak. And I wrote a piece called From Draupadi in English, From Draupadi to Draupadi. So my argument with respect to the gender issue is that Draupadi is the reason why we should be concerned about women's issues, but she is also the reason for being optimistic about women's issues. So I write, when we enter, reading Mahabharata itself to me is like entering a hall of mirrors. When you enter the hall of mirrors, we see ourselves seeing ourselves, right? The images are really infinite when you are, in the circle of mirrors. So that means, so it is both kind of daunting, but as Suktankar in his critical edition says, ultimately reading the philosophy, Mahabharata is a philosophy of the self, finding the large capital self in the smaller self, in whatever way we want to interpret. So when we enter the hall of mirrors, I argue that the Draupadi is both the mirror and the reflection. We must identify the blemishes and wonder what kind of image we want to see. The stain and the stain remover are in the mirror. Just as how Abhinav Gupta says, we need to see ourselves through the mirror that is Shiva, right? I'm saying that in order to understand the gender issue, we need to sort of see through the mirror, perhaps, of Draupadi or any other, epic characters. Because since I studied and did research on this, I'm going to concentrate on that. So our story comes from Draupadi and goes to Draupadi. So in other words, that is my point about that circularity of it. The question is also from Draupadi. The answer also comes from Draupadi. Yeah. So I'm just using that her as an emblem because she is a challenge to patriarchy and misogyny. She is both a victim and a victor, and these are sort of fundamental to when we raise the question about. So when you Draupadi is both a palimpsest and a contradiction. The entire history of womanhood in all its glory, in all its horror, everything is sort of written into that history. So, as I earlier said, when we inherit the text, we are also inheriting the categories of interpretation, and those categories of interpretations are very much gendered, whether we like it or not, because history has played a critical role. That's why, going back to my subtitle, The History of Understanding and Understanding, understanding itself has a history. Our interpretive categories, it's a, someone like Hegel and Kant, they don't want us to believe that. They say there are these categorical imperatives. Everything is sort of according to logical, mathematical kind of categories that are untouched by history. It is purely logical, objective, and so on and so forth. And that's why there is a wonderful book, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, a debate between Hegel and Humboldt, on the Mahabharata, on Bhagavad Gita itself. And by, Hegel could not squeeze the Mahabharata into his sort of, into this epistemograph, like that linear graph, because time itself, some of the things that when you have given the title, Women's Position, I find that position itself is very problematic because it assumes a certain stasis, as if it is fixed, and it is a very spatial category rather than temporal category. I like to think of it as shifting positions propelled by the forces of time. And there are contradictory forces in history, contradictory forces in the gendered category itself. So therefore, these sort of fixed notions, when you say position, it is a very spatial category. It kind of fixes, and I don't, first and foremost, whether it is a male or a female, our positions that we hold is all the time shifting, and without that kind of an what in physics we call as Heisenberg principle, without that shifting, positions, we cannot talk about any aspect, be it interpretation, whether it is about gendered, notions, because there is a certain vacillation, because when the woman is both a contradiction of a victim and a victor, it cannot fall into this either or category, right? And therefore it needs to be sort of seen as a movement rather than the fixity. Now coming to the, so how, just to briefly once to get, in my study, what do we mean by sort of gendered interpretations? For example, when Draupadi is saying that she's going to be vengeful and she'll dip her hair in the blood of Dushashan, people find it very grotesque, and that she's violating the code of womanhood itself. Right? So both within the text itself, Karna calls her a Vaishya. So that means that within the text itself, there is a sort of a misogynistic that if she's married to 5 men, what's wrong in taking on the 6th kind of a thing. But at the same time, she is also violating the category of historically defined womanhood. I'm not talking epically or scripturally, but rather historically, lived time, lived history. So the lived history has already inserted the categories. So many, some of the plots that I studied was Draupadi's laughter in Maya Mahal. That itself is also, many would say, in my study, many subjects would say, oh God, why is she talking about Nari ki Maryada and all that? Because she did not act like a Nari. She was very much, she violated that. So these are all very gendered. And secondly, when she wants to avenge the insults hurled upon her in the battlefield, because she is goading her husbands into the battlefield. Similarly, even Karna wants to avenge the insults in the battle. He is also seeking the battlefield, but nobody sort of berates him or questions him for seeking, because it is seen as a natural male privilege in order to go and seek the battlefield. Whereas she, although she doesn't enter the battlefield, she is pushing her husbands and baying for blood. That is seen as very unfeminine. So that's what I mean by gendered interpretations, gendered categories. So we cannot talk about, when I say categories of interpretation in the history, right, these categories have already been inserted. I take, in my sort of, I sort of look into Bhartrhari in terms of narrative and temporality. He also argues for multiple temporalities. He sees the Mahakal, and I see Mahabharata as the Mahakal, the great time. That great time always responds to the historical time. So there is a kind of an answerability between this great time and the historical time, and it participates in the intellectual galaxy of the times. And that's where I see the kind of an answerability. How do we answer to Mahabharata? In the being positioned or shifting positions in the cultural matrix and the temporal, facing the contradictory forces of history and culture. And so that's where I think the complexity is. Now coming to the Western world, Archana, do you want it to be interactive, or do you want me, is there any question or anything, any comments? It will be nice to be interactive. What do you say, or do I just simply continue for...
Okay, ma'am. Okay, you are continue half an hour interactive session.
Okay. So just let me know when when you would like to begin the...
Yes, ma'am. 4 to 5, your lecture period, and 5 to 5:30 interactive session.
Okay. All right. So now coming to the Western, thank you very much. I appreciate. I just like it interactive, but I understand the...
Okay.
No problem. No problem. I just wanted to know how you wanted to sort of handle this. Okay, so now coming to the Western world, we could go as far back as, but remember, in the Western, there is this sort of a multiple kind of um, uh, texts about, first and foremost, as you wrote in your concept note, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote about the vindication of the rights woman. These are sort of, or Simone de Beauvoir. So Simone de Beauvoir also begins this text of second as that the categories for them are kind of fixed. This is male, this is female, there is no fluidity, there is no overlap, and it becomes, and later on the geneticists have talked about the kind of a fluidity and a continuum, that male and female are not these fixed categories. But I'll get to that in a moment. So whereas she is saying that the term female is derogatory not because it emphasizes woman's animality, but because it imprisons her in her sex. And if this sex seems to be to man to be contemptible and inimical, even in the harmless dumb animals. So there is a certain way to talk about what is this woman's condition. So in United States, the political women's movement was heralded when someone like Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, or Gloria Steinem wrote, books. So all these sort of schools of thinking is what we can call as liberal feminism, trying to sort of bring in general and broad egalitarian principles into the to address the women's issues. So what is good for the goose is good for the gander, and therefore everything must be equal about, in the job place, and so on and so forth. So that is one way of looking at it. But the problem with the liberal feminism is that they don't necessarily address the other issues about the reproductive functions of a woman, biological differences. All that is sort of seen as only superficial, but deep down everybody is the same, and therefore we demand equal rights. And that is the framing of liberal feminism. Now, the other kind is the Marxist feminism. That is another stream where they locate the gender inequities in class inequities. And therefore, if you can address the problem of class, because they argue that capitalism is really the root cause of gender inequality, because it is motivated by profit, and therefore, and in a practical way, I can see that in America, there is no such thing as a maternity leave. Even if it is there, it's for a very short period. It is seen as disability, right? It's very detrimental to the women's issues. And so when the state does not necessarily encourage childcare and so on, and therefore in this kind of, and corporate world is very much along the lines of male, experience. So there are a whole range of issues, and that is what exactly the liberal feminism sees. They just want equal rights, so to speak. There is another, whereas in the Marxist model, they see that if you can address the problem of class, then all will be fixed. Gender will automatically be, I'm not sure if that also, we can have a during the Q&A session, we can discuss about this. And then there is the radical feminism. See, in radical feminism, they do not necessarily, they want to sort of highlight actually the reproductive qualities, the special nature of a woman, and the special temperament of a woman. So in the radical, someone like Mary Daly, coming from the Christian tradition, she would say that there is no place for women, and women need a separate religion. Separate God, because there is no such thing as femininity is not there in the divine at all. That's not necessary for us. That is in the Indian scenario, that is in the Hindu scenario, it is not at all the case. So Mary Daly writes these very provocative and radical ideas. Even in psychology, for example, when you look at this sort of epistemological issue, someone like Sandra Harding and others have written about, have challenged the objectivity and the, of scientific inquiry, because they're making the argument that the subjective impressions and the positionality and the vantage point of the male is seen as automatically objective, and that the science also is a social science. It is not just simply hardcore. And so within that, that objectivity itself, or that positivist science rather, right? The positivist science that through the neutral apparatus of methodological design, we will be able to uncover and that social values and social systems have no place in the, so science is gender neutral or gender free. But that has been challenged. Someone like uh, Donna Haraway, one of my favorite books was Primate Vision. She says the very narrative about, so the problem is not about just simply whether science itself has an independent existence and it can be uncovered through these objective measures, but the very writing of the science, right, in the narrative, it becomes very gendered. So that whether it is about the animals or whether it is about gender or whether it is about nature, see, that's where I think we need to go back to the in the Indian system of non-duality. Yeah. So in the Advaita system, broadly speaking, whether it is nature, Prakriti, or animals, they all have a certain divinity, and therefore you are not sort of interested in the mastery, the conquest of nature, or that narrative is not that much there. So in order to correct any kind of environmental problems or with animal cruelty or any other things, there is another kind of, like one of the things that I tell my friends, how did you like being in Kashi? I said, there is such a coexistence coming from New York. Over there are stray dogs, there are sadhus, there are beggars. There is too much of proximity, and I see it as a kind of a coexistence. There will be cows walking around, monkeys, uh, kind of harassing, or they just conduct their business. So there is not something that is, you don't need to go to the zoo to see this. It is already there in the atmosphere, and you learn to kind of deal with it. Once I saw a lizard, having lived in New York for 40 years, in the room when there is a lizard, I called my cousin and said, "Oh my God, I'm really, frantic here." I said, "What do you want? In India, you're not going to see, um, uh, 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 you know, uh, what shall I say? Animals and lizards or anything in the household. It's just reality." Yeah? So the point here is the narrative becomes very different when you see through these non-binary categories. So we cannot talk about gender, in these kind of both dualistic categories and, and in the Indian scenario, because it's very different. And now going back to and secondly, one of the things that African American feminists have always written is that the Betty Friedan, when she writes about the feminine mystique, um, that experience of a wealthy white woman is not the experience of a black woman. One of the things that we do in women's studies classes is there is an experiment that was conducted. When you ask women and men how their life would have been, and I do this exercise all the time, if you were born as a member of the opposite sex, most white women would say their opportunities would have been much better, and that they would have, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the opportunities open up and I would have progressed in my career, and there would not be that many obstacles. But black women would say, "Oh God, I don't want to be a black man." See, because the most oppressed is really in American situation, it is the black male. The not that black women are not subjected to racist. So there is the intersection of race, and just as how we can say the intersection of caste and gender and other things, the upper class woman and the lower class woman, other than the womanhood, they don't share the same living experiences. So that's the reason that there is a problem in sort of saying position of women as if it is so monolithic, and that there are no variations within. And that's the reason that I would sort of say that we need to look at it as not transactional, but dialogic. How these positions, how this battle is being fought out, how various kinds of uh, viewpoints or social evaluations sort of enter into the picture. And there would be the gender issue. One of the best dialogue or a debate I find in Vanaparva is between Yudhishthir and Draupadi. See, Draupadi is arguing for the ethic of rage and retaliation. Yudhishthir is arguing for the ethic of restraint and reconciliation. When you look at it in the Western world, they have argued that really all the peace movements should be based on female sensibilities, because she is the mother and therefore she is more compassionate, and she is more emotionally driven, and therefore there is a certain benevolence, a built-in kind of maternal instinct, and that's how it must be based on. I'm not sure if that would sort of in the non-dualistic, in the in the Indian scenario, that sort of characterization would even work, because our goddesses do slay the demons, right? The question is very context dependent, as to who is going to kill the demon. So it is when it is based on the dharma, right, and ethics, that ethics cannot be separated as a male ethic and a female ethic. For example, one of the classic psychological studies is by Lawrence Kohlberg, a psychologist. He studied moral development, and he says that the highest form of moral reasoning is based on universal principles of justice and morality. And the studies, so by the methodology that he used, it so happened that women are always in the conventional level, where they are concerned about relationships and so on and so forth. And so what shall I say, the inference drawn from that is that, look, women are very emotionally tied up, and men are the ones who rise to that higher levels of universal morality. That way you could say even Freud's theory is extremely misogynistic, and it is built on the male experience. The woman is what the male is not. An anatomical part is missing, kind of a thing. So he also says that because during the Oedipal crisis, that the boy has to kind of overcome the emotional pull to be with his mother and learn to identify himself with dad, and therefore he goes beyond emotions into the mental state. Whereas the girl, she need not necessarily separate herself from the mother, because it is based on continuity, and therefore she is going to be emotionally, and therefore that's why Freudian explanation would be that that's why men become rulers and women, because they're too emotional. See, even like America has not had a female president, and even last time when Hillary Clinton was running, my God, the number of misogynistic allegations and comments that were made was really very, very shocking, as to despite the proclaimed advancement of the society and so on, there is, I don't know about you guys, but in where I teach, the number of students who suffer from domestic violence, it's too in fact, I would say old forms of patriarchy has given way to new forms of masculinist, hyper masculinist, very violent kind. All kinds of visible shackles have yielded to new forms. So the forms of misogyny have changed. So even this many years of all this political women's liberation has not necessarily brought about the change. Sometimes when I read the narratives of my students, I said, this many years of women's movement, whatever happened? it's so basically, I think today we have arrived at a different point where there is just overall across the board violence, rather than all forms of patriarchy at least had chivalry, a kind of a protection, some sort of a regard, all those factors. But I think all bets are off in this sort of a hyper masculinist, cultural world that we seem to be inhabiting. And in the Western world, because they have removed the divinity out of nature or of animal world, it has made everything very boring, and everything is based on this kind of a hierarchical organization of conquest and control and so on and so forth. That narrative, I think, would be different if we use, I think that's a very key word, if we are able to understand through the categories of the ancient world, right, rather than borrowing these categories. And that's why I kind of resist this women's positionality. Yeah. Positionality itself is very problematic. Because it assumes a state, a static category rather than, So Carol Gilligan, another radical feminist, she responded to, the, Lawrence Kohlberg, suggesting that women speak in a different voice. Again, she is saying that they embrace the ethic of care, right? Embrace the ethic of care and concern and relationships and continuity. And so in a way, this argument becomes extremely very divisive, right? The men have a certain mode of thinking and women have a certain mode of thinking, and their experiences are vastly different. And therefore, men obey the logic, women listen to their heart. That narrative is very, very strong in the, in women's, in the Western categories, because that division, because it's very difficult. See, time and space have a very different nature or a different quality in the, when I present Mahabharata in the Western world, all the time the question is, who wrote it? Okay, that is easily answerable. But is it just a chronology of events? What time was it written? Where is the beginning? Where is the end? And I say there is no beginning and end in Mahabharata. It is very atemporal. And everybody enters the time. So it's how, nobody sits and reads the Mahabharata as if, yes, sure, scholars. So it's not it's a lived experience. See, in the Western world, these are important when we talk about gender, because we cannot separate the gender from these temporalities and from these spatialities. Because in the, what shall I say, in the Western world, the novel always stands as an emblem for consciousness. That the epic is a closed text. It is done. We cannot feel the epic hero. They are beyond the, familiar contact. That is not true in the, so in the Indians, actually the epic is even more close and more, relevant in the daily life than even a novel. Or there is both an epic, the fluidity is greater, from the novelization of the epic and the epicization of the epic, back and forth. That points out to different multi-temporalities. So whether you talk about Mahabharata or whether you talk about Bharatanatyam, all these ancient art forms, they stretch, both into the past and into the, and come to the present and into the open-ended future. So the multiple temporalities are already there. And that is where I think there is a space for bargaining, to me, the question is not about positionality of the woman, whether she has equal bargaining power. When the Draupadi calls Yudhishthir, Napunshak, and in Vanaparva, the language is very salty. It is even unthinkable, right? In the with the decency and decor that we see today. But at the same time, when you look at any of these epic characters, they were faithful, or they did not walk away from their husbands. But whether it is Gandhari or Mandodari or Tara, but they did not approve of their husband's behavior. They were constantly counseling they showed their disapproval very clearly. It's just that they did not leave them. So the voice was already there. Whether their husband heard or not, whether Ravan heard Mandodari, or whether Dhritarashtra heard Gandhari, that may very well, but were their voices silenced? The answer is no. Right? The voices were not necessarily silent. They did have a voice. They did speak out. And history has shown numerous how much more time do we have, Archana? Another 12 minutes?
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. You have another 12 minutes.
Okay. So much, particularly Ramayana, has been read through these really patriarchal lens. So I'll just give one example, where the text, when when ancient text or ancient tradition meets the modern, there is an exchange. Exchange means the modernity enters into the tradition and tradition. So there is a flow, right? So for example, when I present in any part of the world, the Maya Mahal scene, that's one of the scenes that I always talk about. Automatically, whether it is in Canada or whether it is in Denmark or whether it is in Russia, they all say, oh, how about that? Ancient India had the science of hologram. They are using the modern categories to understand the Maya Mahal scene. That is not literal. So when I look at it from a dialogic paradigm, it is just that there is a dialogic exchange taking place between the ancient and the... So I have done some work on reproductive technologies, and about women. And so when I see the advances in reproductive technology, so when I rethink about how from Devaki's womb, it was transferred to Rohini's womb, it seems like, okay, before this knowledge of this reproductive technology, one saw it as magical, inexplicable, and so on. But once you sort of know about the science, right, the transfer of a zygote from one womb to another, seems like, okay, this is science. So that is what I mean by how modern and tradition kind of overlaps. Or when children watch Mahabharata, the children in my household, or anybody, when they watch Arjun trying to kill Jayadratha, the arrow must be shot in such a way that his head, right, it falls on the lap of his father, Jayadratha's father. They will just simply, respond, oh, GPS guided missile. You see, when people are but this is an epistemological necessity and reality. You cannot see it in any other way because these are the categories. It is through that modern inventions and categories that we are trying to understand an ancient, what was seen as magical, inexplicable, or whether it is about Kunti. Yeah. Was it sperm donation or was it real sex? All these facts, now that we have these scientific phenomena, in our hands, we are able to see that in a very different light. That is my point. Right. So I was in India, I had spoken about this. For example, Sita's Agni Pariksha, that was seen through such patriarchal masculine lens, right? That Ram was suspicious and he wanted the Agni Pariksha of Sita, and how crazy was Ram and Sita, the poor woman, and so on and so forth. But there is another kind of a interpretation also that we can think of. See, that is what is the beauty of the epic texts, because they're constantly inviting interpretations, constantly new dimensions. So they are like generators of new ideas. Of course, the epic heroine is always very semiotically dynamic, because the history of womanhood has been such. Not that the male characters are not necessarily dynamic, but she becomes the contested site. Right, the woman becomes the contested site because of these, gender battle, we could say, gender divisions. So she becomes everything about her is challenged, whether it is about the marital status. Now, coming to the Sita Agni Pariksha, I had a different, once when I was watching on television about a Colombian politician, female. She was abducted by the guerrillas, and she was taken, she was kept in the forest for jungle for about 10 years or so. And then the Colombian government undertook a daring mission in order to rescue her and others. And there were many killings that occurred in that conflict. And of course, she and her many other women were rescued. And when she was asked on the television, whether there was any sexual assault she said, whatever the government reports is fine by me. I don't want to talk about it. Because gynecological examination, rape and other. In other words, once a government undertakes a certain rescue mission, and when they rescue that person, it is mandatory in terms of Raj Dharma, right? In terms of the politics, they need to the testimony of the prisoner alone is not enough. They have to do a certain physical examination to see if there were, even if it is a male prisoner, if an enemy country captures a soldier, even if it's a male soldier, his testimony alone is not enough as to what happened. They will do the physical examination. So I saw the Agni Pariksha in a completely different light, not about Ram's suspicion or something, but at the same time, I have not meddled with the text. My category of understanding shifted from this sort of very patriarchal masculinist category to a kind of a broader political category as to what happens in the in the case of when someone is abducted and brought back. So she agreed. Sita also agrees to the undergoing that, because Ram is not just simply going as a husband, he's also going as the prince of Ayodhya. So it is a kind of the kingdom. So he has to be answerable to the kingdom as to why he had to kill Ravan. So there is a different way in which we can think about these things, as we go in and out of these gendered categories, gendered interpretations. So that is where I think we can find some kind of bargaining power. I don't think completely the human conflicts are not going to be completely resolved. whether, in whatever form, but whether people have equal bargaining chip in order to sort of fight for their rights. There has to be that in-between space where you resist, on one hand, just to, because you're all a bunch of philosophers, the necessity of the other is an epistemological necessity, meaning, unlike what Kant and others say, we cannot transcend our solipsism, but because we cannot transcend our solipsism, we need the other. So the other is a necessity. So when you read even Abhinav Gupta and others, it's very, very clear that the other is already a part, an integral part of. When I look at myself in the mirror, I just don't see how I see myself. I see how I see myself. I also see how others see me. And I'm also responding to how I think others see me. So the other is an integral part of that self. So when you look at things in this sort of a non-dualistic manner, then you are able to sort of find ways of negotiating, dialoguing, and so you both accommodate. See, when you recognize the necessity of the other, because it is an epistemological necessity, you must also know how to resist the oppressive other. The blacks they have been defined by what the whites say, what the black. So if the man takes the authority, it is a narrative construction, right? If they are taking the authority as to what a woman is, and when I don't have that ability to define myself, I need to reclaim that. I need to resist. I need to retaliate. I need to reject, right? Certain characterizations and certain, connotations that are attached to this. Follow. So that is where I think, in a way, when in the Indian system, because we can go way, way back into the scriptures. So there are goddesses who kill demons. The very, when you say corporate world, the portfolio of finance, that's my name, Lakshmi, right, is held by the goddess. When you say a feminist epistemology, I don't have a need to do that, because the very the one who is in charge of that body of knowledge itself happens to be the female goddess, right? The Saraswati, or whether it is the battlefield. People pray to Durga before going into the battlefield. So these issues are not necessarily separated along the lines. We don't need to think like Mary Daly, how we need another religion for ourselves, all for women. We live, that to me is an impossible and unnecessary kind of a task. We would rather sort of have this kind of fluid, exchange. And that is where I think there can be room for, that's where you draw from Draupadi and go back to Draupadi. So it seems to me, I would like to have more exchanges. Archana, shall we stop here? What is the time? I'm in an American time zone, so. Anybody? Archana, do you want to respond? Or Ritu?
Madam?
Yes.
Thank you, Lakshmi Madam. There are two questions.
Okay.
Manisha, open for interactive session.
Okay, madam.
Go on. Is
now
it
the
time?
session is open for interactive session.
Most
questions.
welcome, Yvonne ma'am. Most welcome. Good evening.
There is a short interruption here. Hello, ma'am. Professor Mary Vance is here. We would like to welcome you here. And Dr. Archana Tripathi is also saying welcome to you. Your voice is not clear to us. You will have to unmute yourself. It should be on your screen.
It's not better. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you are. We can hear you now.
Good.
So, okay, Archana ma'am is also welcoming you, and Lakshmi ma'am, please I would like to introduce you to Professor Marie Evans and Professor
Hello.
Marie Evans to you. So, and right now we were having a lecture by Professor Lakshmi, and now the interactive session has started. So, over to you, Dr. Manisha, without doing any delay in the session.
Thank you, Ritu madam. Uh,
Yeah.
on behalf of the organizing committee, we welcome Mary Vance madam. There are two questions posted in the chat box. The first one is by Kalyani Sarangi. How you define the dignity of a woman? Lakshmi madam.
You know, the dignity again is such a fluid concept. We try to look at everything in these kind of a very static, frozen, language. That itself, I find it very problematic. It depends on the situation where your honor is being, when there is an assault or something. So the dignity is you see, these categories are something that we need, particularly as philosophers, we need to go beyond these categories. So when in American situation, when Hillary Clinton is called all kinds of very bad names, then it is the honor of womanhood. It's not just simply Hillary. In fact, I wrote a piece. I know I shouldn't even say this. I might get into trouble. But I wrote a piece that before the elections in 2016, I said Donald is America's Duryodhan. Because the whole, in a way, all this plots in Mahabharata kind of very well fits into this scenario because and the way he was sort of walking behind Clinton, it was so spooky and so horrible. I felt it was like this Vastrabhai, Vastraharan kind of a scenario. And secondly, he wanted to replace Obama. He laughed at Obama, just as how Draupadi laughed at Duryodhan. In a press not, it was a correspondence meet, because Donald Trump started talking about the birth certificate and all that, also fake news. And therefore he got back, and the next day Osama bin Laden was killed, and so that elevated his Obama's position, and he was really furious. So the laughter, and then and I think there are plenty of Mama Shakunis who try to create the do the groundwork to make sure that that is what is called as gerrymandering. They change these landscapes so that he will be guaranteed. I don't even know what will happen in the next month. So, so these plots all the time stir our imagination, and we are able to speak about. So that's where I think if I have to answer the question about the dignity, that sort of hurling, misogynistic, disgusting kind of stalking of a woman and going behind and using, oh my God, foul language. That is where the dignity would be. It's one thing to question anybody's competence. But it is another thing to be indulging in that kind of where the dignity is really assault, being assaulted. Hello, Neeti Singh.
Thank you, madam.
Any other?
Yes, madam.
Go
Another
on.
question is posted by, it's also a generalized type of question by Sandhya Kumari, that how can we change the gender discrimination based mindset in the society? Mostly we can find it in our country. How we can
Again,
change
that
the mindset?
these are, this is sort of gets to be like a manual of how and as if we can fix these problems. It requires a certain great deal of empowerment on the part of the woman, and a certain realization on the part of men, in order to sort of see each other. See, even as ferociously Yudhishthir and the Draupadi fight, they never put down each other in Vanaparva. She even calls him Napunshak. He doesn't seem to sort of, but they're having a very, the entire, to me, the Vanaparva is like a wonderful sort of like a debate. And I mean, see, I think education systems should be responsible for this kind of an empowerment. So there is no scarcity of philosophers, female philosophers in the Indian system, from Maitreyi to Gargi to even the debate between Shankaracharya and Mandan Mishra was sort of orchestrated and refereed by Bharati, the female philosopher. She was incredibly powerful as a thinker in her own right. So that the woman is not capable of becoming a philosopher, these things are not so much there, and unless you sort of so you have to go back to the ancient, these categories must become more and more salient in the thought processes. So without that, if you're going to be trapped in these binary thinking, then we are all the time talking about this hierarchical I think we need to speak about it in terms of shifting positionalities rather than static positionality.
Madam, another question is posted by Trajit Saikia. First of all, she wants to know that whether she could go for a research work about the role of female goddess in our Hinduism. And as a second part, she wants to know why the role of woman is secondary in Western society. And can you highlight in some of the points?
It's in terms of this, we need to understand one thing. In terms of the social reality, whether it is in India or whether it is in the Western world, there are very highly accomplished women in both the cases. There are various forms of misogyny in both. The social reality is more or less, I would say, I mean, there are variations. So that itself is not, quite very much relatable. I think what I'm saying is, unless and until we sort of, not that gender can be eliminated or gendered categories can be eliminated, but we need to point out how that is coming from history and how that history, that historically affected consciousness can undergo correction. We don't need to sort of accept. So unless those categories through which the lens of the mind, the genre has to change. In fact, I would say for me personally, it is not just the political. It's very easy to go to the streets and shout something and create a movement. I don't care about those, because even with respect to the, in America, the Black Lives Matter, which is very important. But to me, it is the classroom that matters the most. Many people can speak about, political rights and everything, go to the street and do some protests and join. It's very easy to join the bandwagon of any political, but it is very difficult to cede your territory and make room for the different other. That is what is needed. I mean, in America, everyone gave, we have zero tolerance for, racism, blah, blah, blah. But are there practices that, racially equal? The answer is no. That is what is more important. Right? That whether when you go to the job interview, are they seeing you through this, categories? This is a woman, she will get pregnant and therefore she doesn't deserve a job, or etc., etc. Those are problematic. That is where the discrimination comes from.
Thank you, madam. Ritu, madam, please, you have asked for the questions.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a wonderful lecture. And the way you have tried to present the Western and Indian perspective from the point of view of spatiality and temporality of women, that has been very wonderful. But I have some query to raise. Like, first of all, when you said that it is more temporal rather than spatial, okay? because when we set the position of women, then you don't agree with that thing, that there shouldn't be the position. But I would like to disagree here, because I guess the specialty is as important as the temporality, because the situatedness of a woman is as important as the time in which she is living. So there will sometimes this misogynistic and patriarchal society has tried to fix it, because of the norms of the society, moral codes of the society. So that is one point which I want to raise. And the second point is that when you have tried to present the Indian perspective, where we have seen that Draupadi and Gandhari and Mandodari, they have been at least capable of raising their voices against whatever has happened to them, or against them, or whatever has happened against any woman. So that is like, they had the dialogical power in their hands, so nobody was stopping them from doing that. But that was quite limited, in the sense that only a few women were capable of doing that. And also if we see the reality, like in today's world, if we look at the Indian society, how many women are capable of doing that? And whether even if we have gained legal rights and all, still those legal rights are not making us so much capable of raising our voices. And even if these women whom you have already instanced here have raised their voices, but who has listened to them? How to what extent it has changed the scenario, whether Gandhari was listened to by the Dhritarashtra, whether Draupadi's questions were answered. Like everybody was like, these responses were given in a very misogynistic way. So we'll also have to see that what kind of situatedness these women used to have in those periods. So these are the two clarification I need
think
from
your
you.
point is well taken. I'm not completely sort of objecting, but I don't want that spatiality must be charged with temporality. That is my point. It cannot be sort of the time and space cannot be sort of, so exclusively, that is my objection. Exclusive spatiality assumes a certain stasis, and they, but throughout history, when we look at, even though the men did not hear, Dhritarashtra did not listen to Gandhari, Ravan did not listen to Mandodari, no doubt about it. But I must disagree that Yudhishthir did argue with, and it's not like they did go to war after all. So, and there were other brothers who were pretty much, Bhim was all the time trying to. So Draupadi was a different character, I would say, because
Probably
she posed
probably because she was the Samraggi.
Yes, I mean, her temperament is that, she's not, she was born out of fire. Sita was born out of earth. So their temperaments are going to be very different. And more important, she in the polyandrous relationship, only Draupadi is the only character. So that's why she's an irritant to patriarchy. So, so even within the text and in the literary history, her role has been both celebrated and berated. So Subramanya Bharati celebrates, but there is many, even in my subjects will say, "Are ye kya nari ki maryada?" All this she's talking about. She's not even, in fact, in another, recently when I gave a talk in one of the universities in India, one woman says, did Draupadi even have that maternal feelings? I said, why are you desexualizing and feminizing that woman? Because she fought for something, and you're finding, and I've seen a play in Mumbai where Draupadi is washing off her hair, or where, I've read the Odia writer Yajnaseni, and she says, my Draupadi is a very, when does Draupadi and Sita cannot cease to be Draupadi and Sita? They have to be who they are. Why are you trying to make them into some really, I mean, if I read the Yajnaseni by Pratibha Ray, she comes across as this, sort of woman serving 5 husbands, and I said, this is not Draupadi at all. Draupadi has ceased to be Draupadi, Sita has ceased to be Sita. So that I don't want to completely go interfere and meddle with the text. I want to honor the text. But at the same time, I'm trying to use the modern categories to sort of give a different interpretation. So it is always subject to multiple. So I'm not questioning the just the position. You are absolutely right. To today's world, we have, in fact, even the distinction between East and West makes no sense. Everywhere there are problems. As in the Western world, so much domestic violence, so much is going on. So I don't want to sort of treat, but I'm just saying that where does the scope for change come from? So if we can get past the binaries in our education system, empowerment can happen. That's my only thing. I don't want to reject the pathetic, ghettoization of womanhood. No way.
Okay.
You know.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Very good evening. I'm Dr. Rekha Ojha here. May I ask something?
Yes, sure.
This is Rekha Ojha from B.H.U University.
Okay.
Ma'am, I must appreciate the way you have really analyzed all these theories of feminism. There is a small query, like you have mentioned about Agni Pariksha, where the Sita is being taken Pariksha on fire, and you have also categorically mentioned about the this kind of testimony used to be taken for the male prisoners also. So I don't know how, I cannot relate these two. Where will I get the references? This is
There's
the
no
one.
reference. It's just that my thinking. I don't know if there
Uh,
is any reference, Rekha. It's just that and there was quite, when I presented this interpretation, there was considerable receptivity in many parts. I tried to, that's why I made it kind of personal. That, it used to bother me, that Agni Pariksha, quite a bit as a woman's, studies
Once we
person.
get the references, then there won't be any controversial issues on Agni Pariksha,
Well,
I
then
think
I
so.
have to write
But
about
well,
it,
it's
and then I have to write about it. It's just a thought that came from my mind. That's all. I don't know. I didn't read it anywhere. It's just that when
okay, okay.
see, these things are not. These things must stir our imagination. That's my point. It just. We don't need that kind of reference. You can make it your own too, Rekha. Sorry, Miss Oja.
Okay, okay. The second second thing which come to my mind during this discussions, like when you talk about the education system is responsible for making women empower. So we all are educated women. We all have joined in this webinar or workshop. So do you think well-educated women are empowered in the present scenario? Like not in a very specific way. I just want a general observation. What do you say about this?
No,
What
absolutely.
is your
First and foremost, that whatever has been studied needs to be internalized. We have to sort of encourage the philosophy of act. These are not just abstract concepts to be studied in the universities and right, and then it makes no
Of course
difference in
not.
your personal life. That is horrible. It needs to sort of see, that's the reason that even in academic world, there are, Ms. Oja, academic world also has its own dogmas and fixed categories. There is no, so there are dogmas come in many form, right, left, methodological, there are so many dogmas. So we need to sort of fundamentally address the problem of dogma. And I think we need to sort of understand that even this positionality means of the professor and the student, allow the student to also grow. And I'm eternally thankful to my advisor, a Jewish man in Brooklyn, in New York, who knew nothing about Mahabharata, but he was so sucked into the story that it worked to my advantage. He allowed me to argue. And he would always say, my God, you're a pain in the neck, and blah. It was much more salty than that. But it allowed me to sort of hone my argumentative skills, and there was no fear. You have to sort of create universities, whether it is a male or a female, they need to sort of operate in a fearless manner, to raise questions, to ask questions, not use students as mechanical mouthpieces to advance your own philosophy or your own political agenda. These are dangerous and detrimental, in my view. Very detrimental. I think that there, I think that's a shared experience of whether you're a male or a female.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not so gendered. Gender might enter the picture occasionally, right? You need to sort of set that power in order to in order for the student to find their voice, whether it is a male or a female.
True.
So academia cannot become you know, some sort of a manufacturing company. You're manufacturing minds. No, we have to go back to what Tagore said, that free mind. You have to create that culture. And unless and until we do that, I don't see any hope, frankly.
True, very true, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Shivani Sharma want to ask some questions.
Okay.
Please, Shivani ji, ask your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Rajesh. Dr. Lakshmi, this is Dr. Shivani Sharma from Punjab University, Chandigarh. It was really enlightening to listen to you, and I think that consecutively we had an opportunity to listen to professor from City New York College. We had a lecture of Professor Lou Maronoff yesterday. And today, it's an opportunity to listen to you. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Archana ji and Rajesh ji. I completely agree with your interpretation, ma'am, with regard to the, when you say that epic books are constantly inviting interpretations and they are not a closed kind of a thing. I completely agree with you. And this interpretation of events, like, as you just said, the transference of zygote and, you know, the GPS enabled. Now, these are the things that, you know, that gives us an insight into the possibilities and potentialities of the events that took place in the temporality of Mahabharata, in the context of Mahabharata. So I completely agree. But the problem that I foresee for coming India, for the upcoming situation in India, with regard to feminism, how do we place it? Do you actually see the kind of feminism that has developed in the West has a place in India, just as it has?
You know, actually, all isms, Shivani, I find isms to be problematic. All isms can trap you. They imprison you and they fix you in that, and then you become a slave to that. You know, and I find that in general to be extremely problematic. So I don't even call myself a feminist or anything. It's a waste of my time. I just don't want. That's why to me the dialogicality had a great appeal. Bhaktin is my specialty. The reason that it has such an appeal for me is that it is not one particular ideology, but it is debate between ideologies. So I'm more of a Dostoevsky. Yes.
That was a lovely interpretation, I would say. And another point that you were referring to, Bhartari Hari's Mahakal and multiple temporalities. What was that context? I probably wanted you to elaborate on that. The multiple.
That will be another talk, I think.
I know, but that was a lovely idea, which really we should have elaborated.
Because I was trying to interpret how Mahabharata is, see, because in the Western world, the epic and the division between the epic and the novel is very distinct. So the epic is a closed text. It is the past. It is, you know, it is sealed. That the reason that they, you know, see, Mahabharata or Ramayana, they are both repositories of ideas. They are generators of new ideas. They are, you know, cultural kind of, they are frozen cultural, you know, ideas. So all that categories are just simply there, and therefore it allows, because it is an open. See, Hegel could not understand. I used the Italian thinker Jean-Baptiste Vico. From a Vicodian analysis, I don't need to squeeze it into that kind of a linear trajectory at all. Linearity is not something that the Mahabharata even remotely is, even if you don't know any of these philosophical categories. So
Yeah.
it is a river that flows forever, and then
Right.
it picks up fragments. So that's where Bhartrahari becomes very, it gives you an explanatory capability, because the flow of the river, because he equates time itself as a flow, and the flow of the river will pick up fragments from its, the banks of the river, and then hides it into the depths of the river, again displaces it elsewhere. But because Kala is Brahman, for the Brahman also, or they respond in specific forms for different specific time, different specific culture, space and time. So Mahabharata is a condenser of cultural memory. That was the word.
Right. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll get back to you on this issue.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Thank you, Lakshmi Madam. As we are running short of time, I just want to confirm from Archana Madam and Ritu Madam, should I convey the vote of thanks, or shall we proceed with this conversation?
Manisha, you will proceed.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of the organizing committee, I extend my heartfelt thanks for such an encouraging, enlightening, and thought-provoking deliberation by Professor Lakshmi. You have beautifully discussed that Mahabharata is a dialogical consciousness-based text, a new way of looking at our historical, our epical mythological text. How Panchali, she as a mother India, you have portrayed her, and how
Not
nobody
me,
questioned.
not me.
Yes,
Superman
means
Bharati. I don't
yes,
want to take credit.
Abhimanyu Bharati, and how you have discussed their ideas, and how she questioned, and her questions are not answered by the people. And you have discussed about the writings of Amrita Pritam, and how you have recreated it from Draupadi to Draupadi, and how she is the reason to be optimistic towards the issues of women, and Draupadi is both the mirror and the reflection. And similarly, you have discussed from your own field that how Sandra Harding has also challenged the objectivity of the scientific inquiry, which was very much been focused by the mainstream epistemological writers. And how Carol Gilligan, in her Ethics of Care, beautifully discussed the important role played by a woman, and how whether a woman has a bargaining position. This is a very important question, and their voice is not silenced, which has been every time we used to listen that they are unheard voice. Not, it is not a fact. The thing is that where the ancient tradition meets with the modern, it has a overlapping effects on each other, and we have to take into consideration this aspect. And similarly, you have cast light on Sita's Agni Pariksha. It is always seen with a masculine specs, but there are so many new ideas could be generated from that perspective, that the testimony of prisoner is alone is not enough. You have discussed beautifully with some examples, and how Ram has to be answerable to the kingdom and follow the Raj Dharma, and we cannot transcend from our solipsism. It is very essential. And how we should overcome this binary opposition in education, that is a matter of account. And with these words, I'm very much thankful to you, madam. You have spent your time with us and definitely enlightened us with such a thought-provoking brainstorming and new ideas. Now over to Archana madam and Ritu madam.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. your wonderful presentation, informative session, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you, very.
Evans ma'am. Yeah. Evans ma'am, would you like to say anything? A few words, probably.
I think you need to unmute.
Yeah, you will have to unmute yourself.
No, she has not unmuted.
Yeah, ma'am, please unmute yourself first.
Whoever is the moderator, you won't be able to unmute her?
No, actually, uh, yeah,
Okay.
she will have to. Yeah, now it's
Can you
there.
hear me now? Okay. I do have a number of things that I want to say, actually. And I want to also say, I also want to begin by saying thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. And I've been listening to it with great interest. What I want to say, first of all, is to say how important it is, I think, to say that for a long time, both philosophy and the social sciences have been assuming that the human subject is male. And I think that that is a really important thing which we have to go on recognizing. Post-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment canonical philosophy of the West bases assumptions on a male human subject. And with that goes assumptions about autonomy, individualism, and the place where that human subject might exist, work, and relate to others. Now, that has hugely important implications for how you translate the discipline of philosophy, the discipline of other social sciences as well, and humanities, into a discipline which actually includes women. How are you going to say that nowadays, what in the 21st century we are doing, how are we going to include in that kind of tradition a subject which is not simply male? Now that's the problem because of the virtues and the assumptions that we make about the human subject. And it seems to me that one of the questions for women, and to a certain extent for feminists, but certainly for anybody working in areas where we want to actually bring about a different understanding of the human subject, is what we do with those assumptions of autonomy and the state of carefreeness, which we have always assumed about men. That is to say, it seems to me that it's very difficult for us to abandon those assumptions and to start to think about human beings in terms of different kinds of social relationships. What I'm doing here is making a case that challenges what people in the West, the number of people in the West have said about what we assume about women, that they care, that they automatically have some kind of way of life, some kind of assumptive world, which assumes that they are responsible for the care and the nurture of others. Now that assumption, I think, is so deeply rooted in Western society that we are still trying to deal with it. This is not so much about a question of discrimination, it is not so much a question of exclusion, but it's an assumption, it's part of an assumptive world. And that's the point that I really want to get over here. That we can't easily abandon this kind of thinking about women. Now, when we do that, when we start to ask questions about what we assume about women, it also seems to me that we run up against I don't understand what's happened. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, we come up against two questions, which are I think, are part and parcel of the previous talk. One is that, of course, we have to recognize that certainly in the West, there are two traditions within philosophy. One is what we call continental philosophy, an idealist tradition, which acts with very abstract concepts and assumptions. The second is that of social philosophy, which attempts to place philosophical questions within a social context. And that is the one where I think somebody like me, who comes from a discipline of sociology, works and thinks. And I think about those two concepts which you've been talking about in your previous discussion, which those are the two concepts which I want to talk about are, first of all, empowerment, and secondly, exceptionalism. Now, to me, the question of empowerment is very much a problematic idea, not least because it seems to me to be actually assuming that what women should be doing is becoming a kind of a female version of the male human subject. I would argue, and this is a position which I think I share with some others, is that women are in various ways already empowered. Women do a great deal of the work that sustains every social structure across the planet. Women care for others, and without that free work of women, most societies would not continue to exist. So when we start to talk about empowerment, what exactly are we talking about? Now, this is not, I think, a question of just saying, do we hear women's voices? What do we allow women to do? Because in many ways, what women have been allowed to do and expected to do has been vastly extended in many Western industrialized societies. But what has not been achieved, it seems to me, and this is another form of empowerment, is that women have not been allowed to put on the public agenda the assumptions which are made about them. And this is really important. So the real empowerment of women, it seems to me, is to ask the social world in general to recognize not just what women could do, but what women are doing already. And unless you allow that space in the social world, you are making it very easy for that social world to assume that it's only when women do the things which men have previously done that they are empowered. So I'm arguing for a much wider and a much more socially and historically specific account of what empowerment actually means. I do not think that we can go on talking about human subjects in that pattern which comes from the Enlightenment, which has persisted for 200-300 years, in which people, the ideal person, is the independent, is the autonomous, is the person who is very much judged not for their all-round behavior as a human being, but for their behavior in the social and political world, the public space in particular. We have to judge human beings in different ways. We have to think about who human beings are in terms of different kinds of relationships to others. And that seems to me to be a real problem for us to get round and to consider. The second thing that I want to do is to try and engage, and I think this is really important, with the question, and it's very much related to empowerment, of exceptionalism. Because it does seem to me that we cannot, if we wish to change or enlarge what women can do and how women are thought about, we have to get away from this idea of thinking about exceptional women, praising women who have broken through glass ceilings, etc., etc. There have always been exceptional women. Sometimes they've been forgotten, sometimes they've not been written about. But the point is, if we look back certainly at the history of much of Europe in the last 2000 years, they have always been there. So exceptionalism is an old tradition, I think, in cultural values, but it's also one which has very important political problems because it allows us very often to think that if one or several women have achieved something, then that is a possibility that is open to millions of other women. We mustn't do that. We must make the rethinking of how we see women a general issue and not a question of what it allows a few particular and generally privileged women to do. the whole basis, it seems to me, of what education, what thinking about what men and women do in the 21st century, I think has got to forge a new sense of the human subject. And this human subject has got to recognize that it has to give up some of those ancient traditions about what human subjects are. And that, I think, comes very much from a long tradition of Enlightenment philosophy. It includes, therefore, a human subject who relates to others, who cares for others, who does not see themselves simply in terms of an individual forging their way through their life, through their career, through their making of themselves. So it's a very, I think, important shift that we have to make in terms of our assumptions about ourselves and about others. That we do something with the differences between men and women, which we are now recognizing and which we are seeing, and which to a certain extent we are also getting much more, I think, we're becoming much less binary in thinking about those differences. But what I think we also have to make sure that we don't do is to retain those assumptions about what I would describe as the ideal person is like. So care, the differences, if you like, that I'm suggesting are the differences between what we've expected of women in terms of caring, what we've expected of men in terms of autonomy. Secondly, how we judge men and women. All that's the second area of where things have to change. And thirdly and finally, I think we have to think about the generalizations that we make about men and women. That goes back to all these questions. You know, we have to think about how women, yes, we can talk about a category, but women are as much divided as men, and they are divided socially in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of class. And we cannot, I think, do social philosophy in the 21st century unless we recognize these differences. It just doesn't make any sense, except, of course, in those extreme situations of absolute misogyny, of the refusal to women as a category of basic human rights, the refusal to educate women, the refusal to allow women access to the public space. Of course, we protest when we come across that kind of real legal institutional misogyny. But in other contexts where there is a social recognition of the granting, if you like, of human rights, civil rights to both men and women, we also have to be very careful when we start to talk about women, and we have to start to think about the differences which still persist. So I'm afraid that what I'm suggesting here is that women, as people again have said more than once, women have to work a double shift. We have to think of ourselves as women who defend the human rights of all women, but we also have to think of ourselves as women who have particular histories, and particular histories where we have to resist both the traditions which have made assumptions, binary assumptions about women, men and women, but also assumptions which assume that women exist, act, relate to others as a single category. Because anybody who looks at any social information for more than 2 seconds realizes that that is not the case, that the differences between women are significant, very important, and often very troubling. So I'm going to stop at that and ask you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivans ma'am. This is like, since we are running out of time,
Yes.
because the session has to be over by 5:30. And if Lakshmi ma'am wants to say anything, she can. Otherwise, thank you so much for bringing out this notion of the human subject and how human rights and all the other problems women are facing at the practical level are important. to look, we
Thank you
cannot
very
avoid,
much. I don't have much
obviously.
to say, but
So now it's over to Lakshmi ma'am. Yeah.
no, I'll be very brief. I appreciate all the questions and the receptivity, even with this digitally mediated, discussion. And it's a great honor and privilege to sort of chat with you all and share my thoughts. So thanks a lot, Archana, for inviting me. I know I was like very reluctant given my teaching load. Then you were very persistent, so I appreciate that. And I somehow
Thank you
managed.
so much, ma'am. Thank you so much,
My
ma'am.
pleasure. Thank you very, very
Yeah,
much.
thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Professor Mary Evans. I
May I,
appreciate your comments. Thanks a lot. Take care.
may I say one other? May I say one other thing?
Yeah.
I'm new to these kinds of joint global conversations, and it's been a real pleasure to be at this one. So can I say a huge thank you to everybody?
Thank you.
It's been a real, I hope, no, it's been a real pleasure. And I really hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. I'm sure it will be a great success. Thank you very much.
I wish you all
Thank
the
you so
very
much,
best
ma'am.
for tomorrow. I think you're having or whatever the number of days. So very well. It's nice to come back to at least Varanasi digitally, but I know there are people from all over the country. But thanks a lot. It's truly an honor and a privilege to chat with you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye. Good night to you,
Okay.
and my day is yet.
Okay.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.